Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that might make you pull your blanket a little tighter, something that makes those little sniffles you get feel like a walk in the park. We're going deep into the shadowy corners of history, to times when an invisible enemy could sweep through a city, a continent, and utterly reshape the human story. Forget your hand sanitizer and your instant access to medicine. Imagine a world where the very air you breathed, the touch of a loved one, could be a death sentence. It's a stark contrast to our cozy modern lives, isn't it? So, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to walk alongside the ghosts of those who faced the strange epidemics that changed everything. Alright, find that cozy spot because we're about to step into some truly grim history. You're standing on a cobbled street in medieval Europe, let's say Florence in the year 1348. The air, even now, carries a complex tapestry of smells. Wood smoke from hearths, the pungent aroma of human and animal waste in the gutters, the sweet decay of discarded market scraps, and underlying it all, a faint, growing sweetness that you can't quite place, but which prickles at the back of your throat. Your modern sensibilities recoil, but for the people bustling around you, the merchant haggling over wool, the laundress beating clothes by the Arno, the priest hurrying to vespers, this is simply life. It's a world without antibiotics, without germ theory, without even a basic understanding of contagion. Your warm home, your clean water, your readily available medical care, they're luxuries so alien to this time they might as well be magic. Here life is hard, often short, and now it's about to become unimaginably brutal. The whispers began months ago, carried on the winds from the east, from the exotic lands of Cathay and Tartary. Tales of a sickness so swift, so merciless, that entire villages were emptied, their inhabitants turned into grotesque caricatures of their former selves. You dismissed them, perhaps, as travelers' exaggerations, as the fanciful dread of the unlettered. But then the ships started arriving in Messina, in Pisa, in Genoa, merchant vessels, laden with silks and spices, but also with a cargo far more sinister. They drifted into port, sails flapping idly, often with no living soul at the helm. When brave or perhaps foolish dockworkers boarded them, they found death, bodies strewn across decks, some fresh, some already bloated and putrefying, all bearing the hallmark of a new horrifying affliction. The rats, the true silent carriers, disembarked unseen, their tiny claws scurrying down ropes onto the docks, and into the very fabric of your city. You might first notice it in the marketplaces, that bustling heart of medieval life. A vendor, usually robust, suddenly stumbles, his face paling. He complains of a crushing headache, a profound weariness that saps his strength. Within hours, a fever rages, his skin growing hot to the touch, his eyes bloodshot and glazed. Then the telltale sign, the grotesque herald of doom. A swelling, dark and angry, erupting in his groin, his armpit, or on his neck. These are the buboes, the namesake of the bubonic plague, and they grow rapidly, becoming agonizingly tender, sometimes bursting open to release a foul-smelling pus. You watch, horrified, as his breathing becomes labored, his speech slurred, until he succumbs, often within 3 to 5 days, sometimes even faster. And then you see another and another. The initial panic gives way to a chilling certainty. It is here. The Black Death. Imagine the sensory assault. The smell, that sweet, cloying odor of decay you first noticed, now intensifies, becoming a constant, suffocating blanket. It's the smell of unburied bodies, of sickness, of fear. The sounds of the city change too. The usual cacophony of commerce and chatter is replaced by the mournful tolling of church bells, ringing almost ceaselessly, marking the passage of countless souls. You hear the cries of the sick, the wails of the bereaved, the desperate pleas of priests administering last rites. The rhythmic chant of the mortui vivo est docent. The dead teach the living, echoes through the streets as carts, piled high with corpses, trundle past, pulled by horses or increasingly by desperate, paid laborers. You see the faces of your neighbors, once familiar, now etched with terror, suspicion, and a chilling resignation. Their eyes dart, searching for any sign of illness in you just as your eyes search theirs. Trust, once the bedrock of community, crumbles into dust. The very fabric of society begins to unravel. Laws lose their meaning as magistrates and guards fall ill and die. Thieves and opportunists roam freely, plundering the homes of the dead and dying. The sick are abandoned even by their own families for fear of contagion. You might see a mother leave her feverish child on the street, or a son refuse to comfort his dying father. The instinct for self-preservation, raw and untamed, dominates all other human emotions. Priests who once offered solace, now refuse to visit the dying, terrified of contracting the plague themselves. The spiritual comfort that was a cornerstone of medieval life evaporates, leaving a terrifying void. Monasteries, once sanctuaries of learning and piety, become charnel houses, their enclosed communities proving to be perfect incubators for the disease. You might witness groups of flagellants, men and women whipping themselves in public processions, believing that by scourging their own flesh, they could appease an angry God and avert his divine wrath. But the plague cares not for piety or penance, it strikes them down just as readily. The economic landscape is utterly transformed. With so many dying, particularly the working class, fields lie fallow, workshops stand idle, and trade grinds to a halt. The sheer scarcity of labor gives the survivors unprecedented power. Peasants, who for centuries had been tied to the land, now find themselves in demand, able to negotiate for better wages, better conditions, or even abandon their manors altogether for greener pastures. The rigid feudal system, which had defined European society for generations, begins to fracture. You might see the lord of a manor, once all-powerful, desperately trying to entice laborers back to his fields, offering wages he would have scorned just a year prior. This seismic shift in labor dynamics will, in the long run, contribute to the decline of serfdom and the eventual rise of a more mobile, market-driven economy. But for now it's chaos, a scramble for survival where the old rules no longer apply. The psychological scars run deep, manifesting in art and literature. You see a proliferation of danse macabre motifs, skeletal figures leading kings, peasants, and popes in a grim dance, a stark reminder that death spares no one. Artists who once depicted saints and biblical scenes, now create haunting images of suffering and mortality, emphasizing the fragility of life. The concept of memento mori, remember you must die, becomes less a philosophical contemplation and more a stark, inescapable reality. You might read accounts written by survivors, filled with a profound sense of loss, a questioning of divine justice, and an almost morbid fascination with death. The world, once ordered by faith and tradition, now feels arbitrary and cruel. The very concept of humanity's place in the universe is shaken to its core. If you are one of the lucky few to survive, what does that mean? Perhaps you possess a natural immunity, or perhaps you simply avoided the most virulent strains, or perhaps it was just sheer blind luck. But you emerge into a world fundamentally altered. The bustling city you knew is now eerily quiet, many homes standing empty, their former occupants gone. Fields are overgrown, churches are understaffed, and the familiar faces of your community are replaced by strangers, or by the hollow-eyed survivors who carry their own burdens of grief and trauma. You might feel a profound sense of guilt, a survivor's burden, wondering why you were spared when so many others, perhaps more deserving, perished. The Black Death wasn't just an epidemic, it was a societal reset button, a cataclysm that accelerated changes that might have taken centuries. It decimated an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population, a demographic collapse unparalleled in recorded history. It led to labor shortages that empowered the working classes, contributing to the decline of feudalism. It challenged the authority of the church, as prayers and penance failed to halt the plague's advance. It spurred advancements in medical understanding, albeit slowly, as doctors struggled to comprehend the disease. It reshaped art, philosophy, and urban planning. It was a terrifying, visceral experience that forced humanity to confront its own mortality and the fragility of its constructs. And as you sit here in your comfortable chair with clean hands and access to a doctor just a phone call away, consider the sheer, terrifying scale of a world where such a thing could happen, where an invisible enemy could, in just a few short years, utterly dismantle the known world. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It killed an old way of life, paving the way for a new, often brutal, but ultimately transformative era. You're no longer in medieval Florence. Instead, you find yourself transported back almost 8 centuries, to the bustling, magnificent city of Constantinople in the year 541 AD. This is the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a sprawling continuation of Rome's legacy, a beacon of civilization in a world teetering on the edge of new dark ages. The air here is different, filled with the salty tang of the Bosphorus, the scent of exotic spices from Silk Road caravans, and the rich aroma of incense wafting from countless churches. The sounds are a majestic symphony of commerce, chariot races in the hippodrome, and the murmured prayers of a devout populace. You stand amidst towering walls, grand aqueducts, and the dome of the Hagia Sophia, a monument to human ambition and faith. Yet, beneath this veneer of imperial might, an ancient enemy is stirring, an enemy that will not only decimate this vibrant city but will also profoundly alter the trajectory of an empire that believed itself eternal. The first whispers, much like the Black Death, came from afar. This time from Egypt, carried by ships laden with grain, the lifeblood of Constantinople. The chronicler Procopius, a contemporary witness, described how the plague, now known as the Plague of Justinian, originated in the port city of Pelusium at the mouth of the Nile. From there, it spread like wildfire along trade routes, following the very arteries of the empire. You might have heard initial reports, perhaps from a nervous merchant, of a strange sickness sweeping through Egyptian cities, causing rapid death. But you are in the greatest city in the world. Surely such a distant affliction could not touch you. Then the first cases appear. Perhaps it's a dock worker, or a sailor recently arrived from Alexandria. The symptoms are terrifyingly familiar to anyone who knows the history of the Black Death, though this is centuries before that later scourge. A sudden, crushing fever, a profound weakness, and then the telltale buboes swelling rapidly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These dark, angry lumps are not just painful. They are a visible mark of the invisible killer, a brand of impending doom. You watch as the disease takes hold, often within mere days, sometimes hours. Procopius chillingly noted that many victims experienced hallucinations, delusions, and a profound disorientation before death. Some would lapse into a coma. Others would suffer from gangrenous limbs. The sheer speed and brutality of the disease leave little time for comfort, let alone cure. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of life, begins to transform into a landscape of fear and death. The streets, once teeming with people, grow eerily quiet. The sounds of daily life are gradually replaced by the mournful wailing of the bereaved, the desperate shouts of those calling for help, and the constant, chilling tolling of church bells, a grim soundtrack to the city's demise. The smell of death, initially subtle, becomes an omnipresent, suffocating reality. It clings to your clothes, seeps into the very stones of the city, a constant reminder of the invisible enemy that stalks every corner. You might see bodies lying in the streets, abandoned by terrified families, their faces contorted in agony. The sheer volume of the dead overwhelms the city's ability to bury them. Pits are dug, vast and communal, filled layer upon layer with corpses, sprinkled with quicklime in a futile attempt to curb the stench and the spread. Procopius recounts how the Emperor Justinian himself ordered the opening of the city's towers and fortresses to serve as mass graves, their interiors filled to overflowing. Imagine the psychological toll. You are surrounded by death, by fear, by the constant threat of infection. Trust erodes. Neighbors eye each other with suspicion, wondering who might be the next to fall, or who might be carrying the invisible contagion. The social order, so meticulously constructed by the Byzantine state, begins to fray. Laws are disregarded. Looters plunder the homes of the dead. The sick are abandoned, their pleas echoing in empty rooms. Even the Emperor Justinian, a man of immense power and ambition, contracts the plague himself, though he miraculously recovers. His illness, however, sends shockwaves of panic through the empire, a stark demonstration that even the most powerful are not immune. The very idea of divine protection, so central to Byzantine imperial ideology, is challenged as prayers seem to go unanswered. The impact on the imperial apparatus is devastating. Soldiers fall ill, weakening the empire's borders at a critical time when Justinian was attempting to reconquer former Roman territories in the west. Bureaucrats and administrators die, paralyzing the government. The flow of tax revenue, vital for maintaining the empire's vast armies and public works, dwindles to a trickle. You might see the grand projects of Justinian, like the ongoing construction of the Hagia Sophia, slow to a crawl as laborers sicken and die. The imperial ambition to restore the glory of the Roman Empire, a dream that had driven Justinian for decades, is severely hampered, if not outright crushed, by the plague's relentless march. The strategic advantage gained by Justinian's generals, like the famed Belisarius, is undermined as their armies are decimated by disease, not by enemy swords. The economic consequences are profound and long-lasting. With a significant portion of the population dead, estimates suggest Constantinople alone lost 40% of its inhabitants, and the empire as a whole perhaps 25 to 50%. Labor becomes incredibly scarce. Fields lie fallow, harvests rot, and cities face severe food shortages. The intricate networks of trade that sustain the empire begin to collapse. The price of goods skyrockets due to scarcity, while wages for the remaining laborers also rise dramatically, reflecting their newfound value. This economic disruption destabilizes the empire for generations, contributing to a decline in urban life and a shift towards more agrarian, self-sufficient communities. The very prosperity that had fueled Justinian's imperial ambitions is systematically undermined by the plague. The plague's shadow stretches far beyond the immediate devastation. It returns not once but repeatedly for the next 2 centuries, each time claiming more lives, each time preventing a full recovery. You might live through multiple outbreaks, each one a fresh wave of terror, each one eroding your sense of security and hope for the future. These recurring epidemics prevent the Byzantine Empire from fully consolidating its gains in the West, leaving Italy vulnerable to subsequent invasions by the Lombards. The plague directly contributes to the weakening of the empire, making it more susceptible to future external threats, particularly the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The demographic collapse means fewer people to defend the borders, fewer people to pay taxes, and fewer people to sustain the vibrant cultural and intellectual life of the empire. The plague of Justinian serves as a chilling precursor to the Black Death, a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability to biological threats in an era without modern medicine. It was a strange epidemic not just for its symptoms, but for its profound geopolitical impact. It didn't just kill millions, it arguably crippled the Byzantine Empire at its peak, preventing it from fully reasserting Roman dominance and leaving a power vacuum that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire Mediterranean world. As you pull yourself away from the stench of death and the cries of the dying in 6th century Constantinople, and back to your own time, remember that the invisible forces of disease have, more than once, dictated the course of empires, subtly shifting the balance of power and forever changing the map of human history. The grandeur of Justinian's dreams, the ambition to restore Rome, faded not by military defeat, but by the relentless, unseen march of a tiny, silent killer. You find yourself now in the heart of the Roman Empire, specifically the bustling city of Rome around 165 AD. This is the Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, stretching from Britannia to Mesopotamia. You walk through forums teeming with citizens and senators, past temples dedicated to gods and emperors, under the shadow of the Colosseum, still relatively new. The air is filled with the scent of roasted meats, the murmur of Latin and Greek, the clang of hammers from construction sites, and the distant roar of crowds from the arenas. You are in a world of impressive engineering, sophisticated law, and a vast, well-organized military that has brought order to much of the known world. Life for the privileged is comfortable, even luxurious, a far cry from the cramped, disease-ridden tenements of the poor, but even for them, there's a sense of imperial stability. Yet, beneath this veneer of strength and grandeur, an insidious enemy is about to arrive, carried not by rats, but by the very soldiers who protect the empire, an enemy that will deal a devastating blow to the heart of Rome's power. The first signs of this Antonine plague, as it would later be known, emerged from the eastern frontiers of the empire. Roman legions, under the command of Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, were campaigning in Mesopotamia against the Parthians. Their victory was decisive, but it came at a terrible cost. As the victorious soldiers marched back through Syria and into the empire's core, they brought with them not just spoils of war, but also a silent, microscopic passenger. The initial reports were vague, a strange illness affecting the troops, causing fevers and pustules. You might have dismissed it as a camp fever, a common ailment among soldiers. But as the legions dispersed, returning to their home provinces, the disease spread rapidly like ripples in a pond. The symptoms were distinct and terrifying. You might first notice a sudden, intense fever, accompanied by severe headaches and widespread aches. Then the telltale sign, an eruption of pustules, often dark and crusty, covering the body. This wasn't the bubonic plague. Historians now largely believe it was a form of smallpox or measles, diseases that would become endemic scourges for centuries. You watch as a victim suffers from intense thirst, their throat raw, their skin burning. The pustules, once they appear, are agonizing, often leaving disfiguring scars for those who survive. Many victims also experience diarrhea and vomiting, further dehydrating their already weakened bodies. Death often comes quickly, within a week or two, either from the disease itself or from secondary infections that seize the opportunity of a compromised immune system. The sheer number of sick and dying begins to overwhelm the nascent medical infrastructure of the empire. The city of Rome, and indeed the entire empire, begins to groan under the weight of the epidemic. The streets, once vibrant, become hushed, then filled with the sounds of suffering. The cries of the sick, the laments of the bereaved, the constant procession of funeral pyres and burials, these become the new soundtrack of daily life. The air, already a mix of urban smells, now carries the distinct acrid scent of illness and the sweet, cloying odor of death. You might see families desperately trying to care for their sick, often falling ill themselves. The fear is palpable, a cold dread that permeates every interaction. People avoid contact, suspicion replacing the easy camaraderie of Roman society. Public gatherings, once so central to Roman life, are curtailed. The joyous festivals, the gladiatorial games, the public baths, all become potential vectors of disease, and people begin to shy away from them. The stability of the Pax Romana begins to crack. The sheer number of deaths, estimated to be anywhere from 5 to 10 million across the empire over the course of its initial outbreaks, and potentially up to 25% of the total population, has profound consequences. The military, the very backbone of Roman power, is severely weakened. Soldiers who brought the disease home now die in droves, leaving legions understaffed and vulnerable. You might see recruitment efforts intensify, but finding enough healthy men to fill the ranks becomes increasingly difficult. This weakening of the legions leaves the borders exposed, particularly in the north, where Germanic tribes are constantly probing for weaknesses. The empire, for the first time in generations, feels truly vulnerable. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spends much of his later reign campaigning on the Danube frontier, not out of imperial expansion, but out of desperate defense against these encroaching tribes, whose pressure was exacerbated by Rome's internal crisis. The economic impact is profound. With so many dying, particularly among the working classes, agriculture suffers. Fields lie untended, harvests are diminished, leading to food shortages and rising prices. Trade routes, once bustling with goods, become disrupted as merchants fall ill or fear travel. The intricate network of Roman commerce, which had sustained its vast cities and armies, begins to falter. The loss of tax revenue, due to a shrinking population and disrupted economic activity, puts immense strain on the imperial treasury. You might witness the emperor's efforts to raise funds, perhaps through new taxes or debasing the coinage, measures that further destabilize the economy and contribute to inflation. The prosperity that defined the Pax Romana begins to wane, replaced by economic uncertainty and hardship. The Antonine Plague also has a significant cultural and religious impact. The traditional Roman gods, once seen as protectors of the empire, seem powerless against this invisible scourge. People begin to question their faith, seeking solace and answers elsewhere. This period sees a surge in popularity for mystery cults and, significantly, for Christianity. You might observe how Christians, often ostracized and persecuted, nonetheless distinguish themselves by caring for the sick and burying the dead, even at great personal risk. This selfless act stands in stark contrast to the widespread abandonment of the sick by others, and it contributes to the growing appeal of the nascent Christian faith. The plague, in a twisted way, becomes a catalyst for the spread of Christianity, demonstrating its compassion and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The very foundations of Roman belief are shaken, opening the door for new spiritual movements. The long-term consequences are immense. The Antonine Plague marks a turning point, often cited by historians as the beginning of the decline of the Western Roman Empire. While not the sole cause, it was a major contributing factor, weakening the empire demographically, economically, and militarily. The population never fully recovers, leading to chronic labor shortages. The military, constantly under pressure, becomes increasingly reliant on foreign mercenaries, diluting its Roman identity and loyalty. The economic downturn contributes to a cycle of inflation and instability that will plague the empire for centuries. You might see the empire, once so confident and expansive, become more defensive, more inward-looking, struggling to maintain its vast borders against barbarian incursions. The golden age of Rome begins to dim, and the cracks that will eventually lead to its collapse become more pronounced. As you step back from the disease-ridden streets of 2nd century Rome, and return to your modern world, consider the subtle yet profound power of this strange epidemic. It wasn't as dramatic as the Black Death, perhaps, but its impact was equally devastating, slowly bleeding the Roman Empire of its strength and vitality. The Antonine Plague didn't just kill millions of Romans. It wounded the empire itself, leaving it weakened and vulnerable to the myriad challenges that would eventually lead to its downfall. It shows how even the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations are ultimately at the mercy of the smallest, unseen forces of nature, reminding us that even in times of peace and prosperity, the world can turn on a dime, and an invisible enemy can change history forever. You are now transported to the heart of Mesoamerica, specifically the highlands of what is now central Mexico, in the mid-16th century. This is a land of breathtaking beauty and ancient, complex civilizations, but it is also a land irrevocably altered by the arrival of the Spanish just a few decades prior. The air, though crisp and thin at this altitude, carries the faint scent of wood smoke, corn tortillas, and the rich, earthy aroma of the volcanic soil. You walk among the descendants of the Aztec, Mixtec, and Zapotec peoples, their vibrant cultures still present, though now overshadowed by the imposing presence of Spanish churches and colonial administrators. Your modern understanding of disease, of genetics, of population immunity, offers a chilling perspective on what is about to unfold. These people, isolated from the old world for millennia, possessed no inherited defenses against the pathogens that have ravaged Europe for centuries. Your comfortable, germ-aware existence is a stark contrast to the immunological innocence of these ancient peoples. The Spanish conquest brought not only steel and gunpowder but also an invisible army of microbes. Smallpox, measles, mumps, influenza, and typhus swept through the Americas in wave after devastating wave, beginning even before Cortés fully conquered Tenochtitlan. These initial epidemics were horrific, wiping out vast swaths of the indigenous population, weakening their resistance to the invaders. But then in 1545 and again in 1576, a new, even more terrifying plague struck, one that the Spanish called cocolitli, a Nahuatl word meaning pestilence or great sickness. This wasn't smallpox or measles, though those were bad enough. This was something different, something utterly devastating. Imagine the symptoms, described by indigenous chroniclers and Spanish observers alike. It begins with a sudden, intense fever, often accompanied by a crushing headache and severe dizziness. The victim's eyes turn yellow, a horrifying jaundiced hue, and their tongue blackens. Then a profuse bleeding begins, from the nose, the mouth, the ears, and even the skin, which develops a purplish rash resembling bruises. The blood might even appear in their urine and feces. The victims suffer from extreme abdominal pain, often accompanied by vomiting. The disease is so rapid and so virulent that many die within 3 to 4 days, sometimes even faster. Unlike smallpox, which left survivors with distinctive scars, cocolitli left behind no such marks, only death and disfigurement from the bleeding. You watch, helpless, as this mysterious illness rips through families, villages, and entire regions, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable suffering. The sensory impact is overwhelming. The air, already heavy with the scent of sickness, becomes thick with the coppery smell of blood and the pervasive odor of death. The sounds of daily life, the grinding of maize, the chatter of children, the rhythmic thud of weaving, are replaced by the constant wailing of the bereaved, the desperate cries of the sick, and the mournful chants of priests trying to appease gods who seem to have abandoned their people. You see bodies everywhere, lying in homes, in the streets, unburied because there are simply too many dead and too few healthy to perform the rituals. The Spanish, themselves baffled and terrified by the scale of the epidemic, are forced to organize mass burials, piling thousands of indigenous corpses into vast pits, a grim testament to the plague's ferocity. The sheer scale of death is beyond anything ever witnessed, even by the Europeans who had endured the Black Death. The social and cultural fabric of Mesoamerican societies is utterly shredded. Entire communities vanish. The traditional knowledge systems, passed down orally through generations, are lost as elders and healers die. The intricate social hierarchies, the complex religious practices, the vibrant artistic traditions, all are decimated. You might see children orphaned, wandering aimlessly, their families wiped out. The few survivors are often traumatized, their world turned upside down, their sense of identity shattered. The Spanish, though also affected, suffer far less, their immune systems having centuries of exposure to similar pathogens. This stark difference reinforces the narrative of divine favor for the conquerors and further demoralizes the indigenous population. The psychological impact is immense. A feeling of utter helplessness, of being targeted by a malevolent force against which no traditional remedy or prayer seems effective. The political and demographic consequences are catastrophic. The cocolitli epidemics, particularly the one in 1545 to 1548 and 1576 to 1580, are estimated to have killed millions of people, some historians suggesting up to 80% of the remaining indigenous population in central Mexico. The population of central Mexico, which may have been as high as 25 million before the arrival of the Spanish, plummeted to perhaps 1 to 2 million by the end of the 16th century. This demographic collapse is one of the most severe in human history. The labor force, the very foundation of the colonial economy, vanishes. The vast agricultural systems that fed millions now lie fallow. The Spanish, who had relied on indigenous labor for mining, farming, and construction, find their colonial enterprise severely hampered. You might witness desperate measures by the Spanish to import enslaved Africans to replace the dwindling indigenous workforce, further altering the demographic and social landscape of the Americas. The epidemics also had a profound impact on the relationship between the indigenous peoples and the Spanish. The devastating death toll made it easier for the Spanish to consolidate their control, as organized resistance became almost impossible. The surviving indigenous populations, weakened and demoralized, found it increasingly difficult to maintain their independence or resist forced labor and conversion. The epidemics, in essence, cleared the way for the full imposition of Spanish colonial rule, accelerating the destruction of pre-Columbian cultures and the establishment of a new social order. You might see the rapid construction of Spanish churches and administrative buildings on the ruins of indigenous temples, a physical manifestation of the cultural conquest that the epidemics greatly facilitated. The mysterious nature of Cocolitli itself is a strange element of this story. For centuries its exact cause remained unknown. Modern research, however, using DNA analysis of ancient teeth, now points to a specific strain of Salmonella enterica bacteria, specifically Paratyphi as the likely culprit. This bacterium, known to cause a severe enteric fever, similar to typhoid, could have been introduced by the Spanish and then mutated or found a particularly virulent host in the immunologically naive indigenous population, perhaps exacerbated by drought conditions and famine. This scientific detective work, centuries later, offers a chilling answer to a historical mystery, highlighting how even seemingly familiar pathogens can wreak unprecedented havoc in new environments. As you reflect on the devastation wrought by the Cocolitli epidemics, and return to your world of vaccines and antibiotics, consider the profound injustice and tragedy of this historical moment. These strange epidemics didn't just kill millions. They utterly annihilated entire civilizations, erasing languages, traditions, and knowledge systems that had flourished for millennia. They represent one of the darkest chapters in human history, a testament to the devastating power of biological exchange between previously isolated populations. The Cocolitli, in its brutal efficiency, ensured the dominance of the Spanish and forever reshaped the cultural and demographic landscape of the Americas, a silent, invisible conquest far more effective than any army. You are now in Naples, Italy, around 1495. The city is alive with the hum of a newly invigorated Europe, emerging from the medieval shadows into the dawn of the Renaissance. The air is vibrant with the scent of the sea, the rich aromas of Italian cooking, and the fresh promise of artistic and intellectual rebirth. This is a world where new ideas are blossoming, where trade routes are expanding, and where the human body, once seen as a vessel for sin, is now being rediscovered in all its anatomical glory by artists and scientists. Yet, into this vibrant, expanding world, a new and horrifying disease is about to explode, one that will not only cause immense suffering but will also ignite a moral panic, shaping social attitudes towards sex, disease, and morality for centuries to come. Your modern understanding of sexually transmitted infections, of safe practices, of treatments, stands in stark contrast to the terror and ignorance that gripped Europe as the Great Pox took hold. The origin of syphilis is one of history's great medical mysteries, debated even today. One dominant theory, the Columbian hypothesis, suggests it arrived in Europe with Christopher Columbus's returning sailors from the New World, perhaps brought back from Hispaniola. Another, the pre-Columbian hypothesis, argues it existed in Europe before, perhaps misdiagnosed or less virulent. Regardless of its exact origin, its sudden, explosive appearance in Naples in 1495, during the siege of the city by King Charles VIII of France, is undeniable. His army, a motley collection of mercenaries from across Europe, became a crucible for the disease. As these soldiers dispersed after the siege, they carried the Great Pox with them, spreading it rapidly across the continent. Imagine the initial symptoms: which would have been utterly bewildering and terrifying. Unlike the familiar plagues that killed quickly, syphilis was insidious, a slow, agonizing descent into madness and decay. The first sign, often appearing weeks after exposure, is a painless sore, a chancre, typically on the genitals, but sometimes on the lips or hands. This might be dismissed or ignored. Then a few weeks later, a secondary stage erupts. A widespread rash, often coppery red and non-itchy, covering the entire body including the palms and soles. This rash is often accompanied by fever, sore throat, hair loss, and debilitating aches. These symptoms might wax and wane, leading to a false sense of recovery. But the disease is merely entering its latent stage, a period of dormancy that can last for years, even decades. The true horror, however, lies in the tertiary stage, which would manifest years later in a significant portion of untreated individuals. You would witness the slow, agonizing destruction of the body, grotesque skin lesions called gummas, eroding flesh and bone, causing disfigurement of the nose and palate. The disease would attack the nervous system, leading to paralysis, blindness, severe dementia, and mental derangement. It could affect the heart, causing aneurysms, and even be passed from mother to child, resulting in congenital syphilis, causing deformities and developmental delays. The slow, visible decay, the disfigurement, the madness, it was a public, agonizing spectacle that instilled deep fear. The sensory details are particularly grim. The smell of rotting flesh, not from immediate death, but from the slow erosion of gummas, would be pervasive. The sight of individuals with sunken noses, scarred faces, and contorted limbs would be a constant, horrifying reminder of the great pox. The cries of the insane, locked away or left to wander, their minds consumed by neurosyphilis, would echo through the streets. The fear wasn't just of death, but of a long, humiliating, and disfiguring decline. This was not a quick, merciful plague. It was a slow, agonizing public undoing. The social impact was immediate and profound, triggering a massive moral panic. Unlike the bubonic plague, which was seen as a divine punishment for general sin, syphilis was clearly understood to be spread through sexual contact. This led to immense shame, stigma, and judgment. It became known by various nationalistic names. The French disease to the Italians, the Neapolitan disease to the French, the Spanish disease to the English, each nation blaming the other. You might witness public shaming, ostracization, and the utter ruin of reputations. Prostitutes, already on the fringes of society, were demonized, but the disease spared no social class, affecting nobles, popes, and artists alike. The very act of sex, once a private matter, became fraught with the terrifying possibility of infection and a slow, public death. The treatments attempted were often as gruesome as the disease itself. Mercury in various forms, rubs, ingestion, fumigation, became the primary, though ineffective and highly toxic, remedy. You might observe a patient undergoing mercury treatment, their mouth filled with ulcers, their teeth falling out, their hair shedding, symptoms of mercury poisoning often mistaken for improvement in the disease. These treatments often made the patient worse, hastening their demise or causing further suffering. The lack of effective treatment meant that once infected, the prognosis was grim, and the social condemnation inescapable. The Great Pox had a significant impact on art, literature, and medicine. Artists depicted its victims, highlighting the disfigurement and suffering. Writers used it as a metaphor for moral decay and divine retribution. Medically, it spurred early attempts at clinical observation and systematic description of a disease, pushing the boundaries of anatomical study. However, it also contributed to a long-standing association of disease with moral failing, particularly in the realm of sexuality, a legacy that would persist for centuries and re-emerge with later epidemics like AIDS. You might see the creation of early pox hospitals, or specialized wards, a nascent form of public health intervention, though often more focused on isolation than cure. The long-term consequences of syphilis were far-reaching. It fundamentally altered attitudes towards sexuality, instilling a deep-seated fear and moral judgment that would shape European society for centuries. It contributed to the rise of public health initiatives, however rudimentary, aimed at controlling its spread. It also continued to be a major cause of morbidity and mortality until the discovery of penicillin in the 20th century. The strange epidemic of syphilis didn't just cause immense physical suffering. It infected the European psyche with a profound sense of moral dread, forever linking disease with sin and shame, and leaving an indelible mark on how societies viewed the body, sexuality, and the invisible threats that could emerge from within. It was a disease that changed not just bodies but minds and morals, echoing through the corridors of history. You are now in England, specifically London, in the summer of 1485. The city is still shaking off the long, bloody shadow of the Wars of the Roses, with Henry VII, the first Tudor king, having just seized the throne. The air is thick with the promise of a new era, but also with the lingering uncertainty of political upheaval. The streets buzz with the mundane activities of daily life, merchants hawking their wares, apprentices running errands, servants fetching water from the Thames. Your modern medical knowledge, your understanding of viruses and bacteria, would be utterly useless here, confronted by a disease so sudden, so swift, and so utterly baffling that it defied all contemporary explanation. This isn't the slow, agonizing decay of syphilis, nor the bugle-laden horror of plague. This is a bolt from the blue, a strange epidemic that strikes with terrifying speed and leaves behind a trail of bewildered terror. The sweating sickness, or Pseudor Anglicus, as it was known, bursts onto the scene with startling ferocity. It first appears in England, seemingly out of nowhere, coinciding with Henry VII's arrival from France. The first outbreak is devastating, particularly in London. Unlike other common diseases, this one has a unique and terrifying signature. It begins with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, a chilling presentiment of doom. This is quickly followed by severe aches in the neck, shoulders, and limbs, often accompanied by a crushing headache. Then the most prominent symptom emerges, an intense, profuse sweat, so heavy that victims describe feeling as though cold water is being poured over them, even as their bodies burn with fever. Imagine the progression of the illness. You might see a seemingly healthy person suddenly gripped by these symptoms. The fever quickly becomes unbearable, the thirst unquenchable. The profuse sweating continues, drenching clothes and bedding, rapidly dehydrating the victim. Many also suffer from a rapid pulse, palpitations, and shortness of breath. The most terrifying aspect, however, is the speed. Death often comes within 3 to 24 hours of the onset of symptoms. There is no lingering, no slow decline. It is a rapid, almost instantaneous plunge from apparent health to the grave. You watch, horrified, as a neighbor who was laughing with you in the morning is dead by evening, their body still slick with sweat. The sensory impact is one of sudden, shocking silence. The usual hubbub of the city is punctuated by the sudden, panicked cries of families discovering a loved one stricken. Then an eerie quiet descends as the victim succumbs, often without a prolonged struggle. The smell of sweat, not just from exertion but from the feverish, dying body, would be a constant, sickening presence. The sight of rapidly decaying bodies, often still clad in their sweat-drenched clothes, would be a stark reminder of the disease's terrifying efficiency. This wasn't a disease that allowed for long goodbyes, it was a thief that stole life in the blink of an eye. The social and psychological impact is one of profound terror and bewilderment. No one understands what is causing it, how it spreads, or why it strikes some and spares others. The speed of death leaves no time for traditional rituals, for last rites, for comfort. People live in constant dread, knowing that any unexplained ache, any sudden chill, could be the harbinger of their imminent demise. You might witness people fleeing cities in droves, desperately seeking refuge in the countryside, only for the disease to follow them. The wealthy often barricade themselves in their homes, hoping to isolate themselves from the invisible killer. The poor, with no means of escape, are left to face the full brunt of the epidemic. The sweating sickness was unique in its geographical limitation. It almost exclusively affected England, with only minor outbreaks reported on the continent, primarily amongst English travelers or soldiers. This peculiar geographical pattern only added to its mystery. It wasn't like the plague, which swept across continents. This was an English curse, a strange, localized terror. It returned in 5 distinct outbreaks between 1485 and 1551, each time causing widespread panic and significant mortality. The 1551 outbreak was particularly severe, striking down thousands and causing widespread disruption before it mysteriously vanished, never to return. The impact on English society, though temporary, was significant during each outbreak. Trade would halt, courts would be suspended, and public life would grind to a standstill. The deaths of prominent figures, mayors, aldermen, academics, would cause considerable disruption to governance and intellectual life. You might see the young King Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, being moved from place to place to escape the contagion, a stark reminder that even royalty was vulnerable. The disease's tendency to strike down the strong and healthy, rather than just the weak and infirm, added to its terror, as it seemed to target those in the prime of life. The mystery of the sweating sickness continues to puzzle historians and epidemiologists even today. Its sudden appearance, its rapid onset and mortality, its unique symptoms, and its equally sudden disappearance make it unlike any other known historical epidemic. Various theories have been proposed: a highly virulent form of influenza, a hantavirus, or even a unique form of relapsing fever. But none fully explain all its strange characteristics. It remains one of history's most enigmatic diseases, a strange epidemic that appeared, terrorized, and then vanished, leaving behind only questions and the memory of its terrifying speed. As you step back from the fearful streets of Tudor England, and return to your modern world with its vaccines and antiviral medications, consider the sheer terror of facing an unknown disease that could kill you within hours, with no warning, no explanation, and no cure. The English sweating sickness didn't just kill thousands. It instilled a unique form of dread, a chilling reminder of humanity's vulnerability to biological forces that defy understanding. It stands as a testament to the strange and unpredictable ways in which epidemics can emerge, devastate, and then, just as mysteriously, disappear, leaving behind a historical puzzle and a profound sense of awe at the fragility of life. You are now transported to the sweltering heat and humid air of the late 18th century Caribbean, specifically the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. The air is thick with the scent of sugar cane, the sweat of enslaved laborers, and the distant rhythmic beat of drums carrying murmurs of rebellion. This is a land of immense wealth for the European colonizers, built on the brutal exploitation of Africans. Your modern understanding of mosquito-borne diseases, of sanitation, of public health campaigns, offers a stark contrast to the ignorance and helplessness that defined this era. Here, the very air itself, or rather the tiny insects buzzing within it, holds the power of life and death, shaping the fate of empires and revolutions in ways no human army ever could. The disease that would become known as yellow fever was already endemic in parts of Africa, and it had been brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. While indigenous populations and those of African descent often had some level of acquired immunity, the newly arrived Europeans were immunologically naive, making them devastatingly susceptible. The disease was a constant threat in the port cities and plantations of the tropics, a silent, invisible killer far more potent than any enemy soldier. Imagine the symptoms of this terrifying disease. It begins with a sudden onset of fever, chills, severe headache, and muscle aches, symptoms that might initially be mistaken for a bad flu. But then, the distinct yellowing of the skin and eyes, jaundice, appears, giving the disease its name. This is followed by a period of remission, a deceptive lull that can last for a day or two, offering false hope. But then, for a significant portion of victims, the disease returns with a vengeance, entering its toxic phase. You would witness the victims suffering from severe abdominal pain, vomiting, often black vomit, a terrifying sign of internal bleeding from the gastrointestinal tract. The liver and kidneys fail, leading to delirium, seizures, and ultimately death. The mortality rate for those entering the toxic phase can be as high as 50%, sometimes even higher. The sensory experience is one of oppressive heat, the constant whine of mosquitoes, and the pervasive smell of sickness. The sight of yellowed skin, black vomit, and the increasingly frantic efforts of doctors who have no idea how to treat it, would be a constant, horrifying presence. The cries of the sick and dying would be a familiar sound in the barracks, on the plantations, and in the bustling port cities. The fear isn't just of death, but of a particularly gruesome, painful death, often accompanied by internal hemorrhaging. This was a disease that turned the body into a living horror. The impact of yellow fever on military campaigns was catastrophic. Consider the French attempt to suppress the Haitian Revolution in the early 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte, exasperated by the persistent rebellion of enslaved people led by Toussaint Louverture, dispatched a massive expeditionary force of over 30,000 veteran troops, led by his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc. This was an army meant to crush the rebellion and restore the immensely profitable sugar plantations. But yellow fever had other plans. You would witness these hardened European soldiers, fresh from victories on European battlefields, succumbing to the disease in droves. They fell not to musket balls, but to an invisible enemy delivered by a tiny insect. Leclerc himself died of yellow fever in 1802. The entire expedition was decimated, with over 20,000 French soldiers dying within months. This military disaster had profound geopolitical consequences. Napoleon, realizing that his dreams of a vast French empire in the Americas were untenable without Saint-Domingue, and with his army annihilated by disease, decided to cut his losses. You might see the direct link between the yellow fever epidemic and the Louisiana Purchase. Desperate for funds and abandoning his American ambitions, Napoleon sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States in 1803, effectively doubling the size of the young American Republic. Without yellow fever, the Haitian Revolution might have been crushed, and the United States might not have expanded westward so dramatically. The disease, in essence, secured Haitian independence and reshaped the map of North America. The disease also plagued American cities, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, suffered a devastating epidemic in 1793. You would see thousands die, including prominent figures. The city was paralyzed, the government fled, and widespread panic ensued. This led to early, often misguided, public health efforts, including attempts to clean the city, though the true vector, mosquitoes, remained unknown. The understanding that the disease was not contagious from person to person, but rather linked to environmental factors, which we now know were mosquito breeding grounds, gradually began to emerge. The struggle against yellow fever continued for over a century, a testament to its persistence and the difficulty of understanding its transmission. It plagued the construction of the Panama Canal in the late 19th century, decimating the initial French efforts, before American efforts under William Gorgas successfully implemented mosquito control measures, finally allowing the canal to be completed. You might read about the heroic, often self-sacrificing work of scientists like Walter Reed, who conducted experiments in Cuba in the early 20th century, confirming the mosquito as the vector, a crucial breakthrough that paved the way for effective control strategies. As you reflect on the devastating impact of yellow fever, and return to your modern world where mosquito control and vaccines have largely tamed this ancient killer, consider the profound ways in which this strange epidemic shaped history. It didn't just kill hundreds of thousands, it granted independence to a nation of enslaved people, forced a powerful emperor to abandon his colonial dreams, and dramatically altered the geopolitical landscape of the Americas. Yellow fever stands as a powerful reminder that the smallest of creatures, carrying the smallest of pathogens, can wield an immense, unseen power capable of toppling empires and forging new nations, all while humanity grappled in the dark for answers. You are now in London in the mid-19th century, let's say 1854. The city is a sprawling industrial behemoth, a global capital of commerce and empire. But beneath the veneer of progress and innovation, a darker reality festers. The air, particularly in the summer, is often thick with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and most notoriously the pervasive stench of the River Thames, which serves as both the city's water supply and its open sewer. Your modern sanitation, your clean drinking water, your understanding of bacteria and disease transmission. These are concepts utterly alien to most people here. This is a world where miasma theory, the belief that disease is caused by bad air or noxious fumes, still holds sway, a world tragically unprepared for the invisible killer that lurks in its water. Cholera, a terrifying and rapidly fatal disease, had first arrived in Europe in the early 19th century, spreading from its traditional home in the Ganges Delta. It had already caused several devastating pandemics across the globe, reaching London multiple times. But the 1854 outbreak, specifically in the Broad Street area of Soho, would prove to be a pivotal moment, not just for London but for the entire field of public health. Imagine the sudden onset of cholera. It begins with a violent, often explosive, diarrhea, quickly followed by severe vomiting. The fluid loss is immense, leading to rapid dehydration. You would witness a victim, initially appearing robust, quickly becoming a shrunken, emaciated figure, their skin turning bluish-gray, their eyes sunken, their voice reduced to a whisper. The thirst is agonizing, the muscle cramps excruciating. Death can occur within hours, sometimes less than a day, from the profound loss of fluids and electrolytes. The sheer speed and horror of the disease make it particularly terrifying. The sensory experience is one of overwhelming stench and visceral horror. The smell of human waste, particularly the distinctive rice water stool of cholera victims, would be pervasive in homes and streets. The constant sound of retching and the desperate cries of the sick would fill the air. The sight of rapidly decaying bodies, often still contorted from cramps, would be a grim reality. The fear is not just of death, but of a particularly undignified and agonizing death, where the body rapidly expels itself before life departs. The social and political impact of cholera was immense. Its rapid spread through the crowded, unsanitary slums of London highlighted the stark inequalities of Victorian society. While the wealthy could often flee to cleaner country estates, the poor, living in squalid conditions with contaminated water sources, bore the brunt of the disease. The prevailing miasma theory led to misguided efforts, such as burning tar barrels in the streets, in a futile attempt to cleanse the air. These efforts did little to stop the spread, only adding to the confusion and fear. However, the 1854 Broad Street outbreak saw the emergence of a quiet, unassuming hero, Dr. John Snow. A physician with a keen scientific mind, Snow was skeptical of the miasma theory. He observed that cholera outbreaks seemed to cluster around specific water sources. While others theorized about bad air, Snow meticulously mapped the cases of cholera in the Broad Street area, plotting each death on a detailed map. You might imagine him walking the grim streets, interviewing families, painstakingly charting the spread of the disease. Snow's map revealed a striking pattern. Almost all the victims lived near and drank water from the Broad Street pump. He noticed exceptions too: workers at a nearby brewery who drank beer instead of water, and a workhouse that had its own well were largely spared. Conversely, a woman who lived miles away but had water from the Broad Street pump delivered to her because she preferred its taste, also contracted the disease and died. You would witness the painstaking process of scientific deduction, a groundbreaking moment in epidemiology. Armed with this compelling evidence, Snow convinced the local authorities to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. The effect was almost immediate. The epidemic began to subside. Though the germ theory of disease was still decades away from being fully accepted, Snow's work provided irrefutable proof that cholera was a waterborne disease, not an airborne miasma. It was a triumph of empirical observation and data analysis over prevailing incorrect scientific dogma. The long-term consequences of Snow's work and the cholera epidemics were revolutionary. They didn't just stop that particular outbreak, they laid the foundation for modern public health. You might see the eventual construction of vast sewer systems, like London's Basildgate sewers, which transformed urban sanitation. Governments began to invest in clean water infrastructure, understanding that public health was not just a matter of individual hygiene, but a collective responsibility. The link between environment and disease became undeniable, leading to widespread reforms in urban planning, housing, and waste management. The strange epidemic of cholera, with its horrifying symptoms and rapid mortality, forced societies to confront the consequences of their unsanitary conditions. It didn't just kill millions across the globe, it served as a catalyst for a paradigm shift in how humanity understood and combated disease. Cholera, and John Snow's brilliant work, moved us from an era of superstition and guesswork to one of scientific inquiry and preventive action. It was a brutal lesson, but one that ultimately saved countless lives and fundamentally reshaped our cities and our understanding of what it means to live in a healthy environment. And as you drink a glass of clean, safe tap water in your modern home, remember the stench of the Great Stink and the lives lost that paved the way for that simple, life-saving luxury. You are now in Paris in the mid-19th century, a city of grand boulevards and burgeoning scientific discovery, but also of stark social contrasts and pervasive illness. The air is often heavy with the exhaust of early industry, the lingering scent of damp, crowded tenements, and a subtle, persistent cough that seems to echo through the streets. Your modern understanding of airborne bacteria, of antibiotics, of effective treatments, offers a stark contrast to the despair and misunderstanding that surrounded tuberculosis. Here, this disease is not just a killer, it is a cultural phenomenon, a white plague, that shapes art, literature, and even fashion, romanticized even as it slowly consumes its victims. Tuberculosis, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is an ancient disease having plagued humanity for millennia. But it reached epidemic proportions during the Industrial Revolution, fueled by rapid urbanization, overcrowded and poorly ventilated housing, malnutrition, and the constant exposure to dust and pollutants in factories. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic killer like cholera or plague. It was a slow, insidious consumer of life, often taking years to run its course. Imagine the progression of consumption as it was then known. It often begins subtly, a persistent cough, a low-grade fever, night sweats, and a gradual loss of appetite and weight. You might observe a loved one growing increasingly frail, their cheeks flushed with fever, their eyes unnaturally bright and dilated, a symptom often described as hectic flush or feverish beauty. As the disease progresses, the cough worsens, often producing blood-tinged sputum. The lungs are slowly eaten away, creating cavities, leading to increasing difficulty breathing. The patient becomes emaciated, their bones visible beneath translucent skin, yet their intellect often remains sharp, even heightened, until the very end. The sensory experience is one of a lingering, sickly sweetness in the air, a combination of illness and the often strong perfumes used to mask the smell of decay. The constant, hacking cough, particularly in crowded tenements, would be a pervasive sound, a grim reminder of the disease's omnipresence. The sight of thin, pale figures, often wrapped in shawls, their faces marked by the consumption mask, sunken eyes, prominent cheekbones, would be a common and heartbreaking sight. The fear isn't just of death, but of a slow, public, and often agonizing decline, draining the victim's life force over months or even years. The social and cultural impact of tuberculosis was unique. Unlike other diseases that were demonized, consumption was often romanticized, particularly in the 19th century. The pale, ethereal beauty of its victims, their heightened sensitivity, their feverish intellect. These characteristics were often associated with artistic genius and spiritual purity. You might see heroines in novels, like Fantine in Les Miserables or Mimi in La Boheme, dying beautifully of consumption. Artists and poets like John Keats, who himself succumbed to the disease, embodied this romantic ideal. This romanticization, however, masked the brutal reality of the disease, particularly for the poor. For the working classes, tuberculosis was a scourge that ripped through families, leaving behind orphans and destitution. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of industrial cities were perfect breeding grounds for the airborne bacterium. You might witness entire families succumbing to the disease, one after another, in the same small, damp room. There was no cure, only ineffective remedies like cod liver oil or lung tonics, and the desperate hope that a change of climate, often to drier, mountainous regions, might offer some respite. Sanatoria, specialized hospitals for TB patients, began to emerge, offering fresh air, good food, and rest, but these were often only accessible to the wealthy. The economic impact was also significant. The slow, debilitating nature of the disease meant that victims would often suffer for years, unable to work, becoming a burden on their families or public charity. The loss of productive labor, particularly among young adults, further exacerbated poverty and social instability. The disease was a constant drain on human capital, stealing away the vibrant youth of a generation. The long-term consequences of tuberculosis are still felt today, though its impact has been dramatically reduced in developed nations. The fear of consumption led to early public health campaigns focused on improving sanitation, housing, and nutrition, efforts that also helped combat other diseases. The development of the tuberculin test, the BCG vaccine, and eventually highly effective antibiotics in the mid-20th century transformed tuberculosis from a death sentence into a curable disease. You might witness the transformation from a world where a cough was a harbinger of doom to one where it's largely a treatable ailment. The strange epidemic of tuberculosis didn't just kill millions over centuries. It became deeply embedded in the cultural imagination, a white plague that simultaneously terrified and fascinated. It highlights how society's perception of a disease can be shaped by cultural narratives, even as the disease itself relentlessly pursues its course. The romanticization of consumption was a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of a slow, agonizing death that seemed to strike indiscriminately. But beneath the poetic imagery lay the grim reality of a relentless bacterium, slowly consuming its victims, forever changing how we view illness, beauty, and the fragile line between life and death. You are now in a bustling city in the 18th century, perhaps London or Boston. The air is filled with the sounds of commerce, the cries of street vendors, and the chatter of a populace living under a constant, unspoken threat. Your modern world, free from the terror of smallpox, cannot fully grasp the omnipresent dread that defined life for centuries. You have likely never seen a case, never known anyone afflicted. But here, smallpox is a fact of life, an almost inevitable rite of passage, a disfiguring and often fatal disease that touches nearly every family. Your vaccines, your global eradication campaigns, are a testament to scientific triumph, but they stand in stark contrast to the helplessness of this era. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, is one of the deadliest and most feared diseases in human history. It is an ancient disease with evidence found in Egyptian mummies, and it has ravaged populations across the globe for millennia. Unlike some other epidemics that flared and faded, smallpox was a constant, endemic presence, periodically erupting into devastating outbreaks, especially in immunologically naive populations. Imagine the horrifying progression of smallpox. It begins with a sudden onset of high fever, headache, and severe body aches, often accompanied by vomiting. After a few days, a characteristic rash appears, first on the face and extremities, then spreading to the trunk. These spots quickly develop into fluid-filled blisters or pustules, that are deep-seated and intensely painful. You would witness the victim's entire body becoming covered in these grotesque, pus-filled lesions, including the palms of their hands and soles of their feet, and even inside their mouth and throat, making eating and breathing agony. The sensory experience is one of profound discomfort and visible horror. The smell of pus and decaying skin would be pervasive. The sight of a smallpox victim, their face a mass of weeping pustules, their eyes often swollen shut, would be deeply disturbing. The fear isn't just of death, which claimed up to 30% of those infected, but of the permanent disfigurement, the pitted, scarred skin, known as pockmarks, that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Many survivors also suffered blindness due to corneal scarring. This was a disease that not only killed but also irrevocably marked those it spared. The social and cultural impact of smallpox was immense. It was a great equalizer, striking down kings and commoners alike. Royal families across Europe were decimated by it, often altering lines of succession. You might see portraits of historical figures, like Queen Elizabeth I, whose heavily made-up face was rumored to hide smallpox scars. The disease was responsible for an estimated 300 million deaths in the 20th century alone, before its eradication. Before widespread vaccination, it was estimated to kill 1 in 7 children. However, the story of smallpox is also a story of scientific triumph and human ingenuity. In the late 18th century, an English physician named Edward Jenner observed that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox, a mild disease from cows, seemed to be immune to smallpox. Building on the practice of variolation, inoculation with smallpox matter, a risky procedure that sometimes caused full-blown smallpox, Jenner began to inoculate people with cowpox matter. You might imagine the skepticism and fear surrounding this radical idea, injecting people with animal disease. But Jenner's experiments proved successful, and the term vaccination, from vacca, Latin for cow, was born. The spread of vaccination was slow but steady, facing resistance from both religious and scientific communities. Yet, the evidence of its effectiveness was undeniable. Over the next 2 centuries, vaccination campaigns gradually brought smallpox under control in many parts of the world. However, it was the ambitious, coordinated global effort launched by the World Health Organization (WHO) in 1967 that truly turned the tide. You might read about the logistical challenges of this campaign, reaching remote villages, overcoming cultural barriers, and training thousands of health workers to administer the bifurcated needle vaccine. The eradication campaign was a monumental achievement. It involved mass vaccination drives, surveillance, and containment strategies to isolate outbreaks. You would see dedicated teams tracking down every last case, vaccinating rings of people around the infected to prevent further spread. In 1977, the last natural case of variola major, the more severe form of smallpox, was recorded in Somalia. In 1980, the WHO officially declared smallpox eradicated, the first and only human infectious disease to be completely wiped out from the face of the earth. The long-term consequences of smallpox eradication are almost incalculable. It saved countless lives, prevented untold suffering and disfigurement, and freed up immense resources that were once dedicated to combating the disease. It demonstrated the power of international cooperation and scientific advancement in overcoming a global health threat. You might reflect on the fact that an entire generation has grown up never knowing the fear of smallpox, a testament to this incredible achievement. Smallpox was a strange epidemic not just for its enduring presence and horrifying symptoms, but for its ultimate defeat. It didn't just kill millions. It shaped the faces of populations, influenced royal successions, and for centuries defined the very risks of human existence. But its eradication stands as a beacon of hope, a powerful reminder that humanity, through science and collective effort, can triumph over even the most ancient and terrifying of scourges, forever changing the course of history and the future of human health. You are now in the midst of World War I, specifically the spring of 1918. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder, trench mud, and the pervasive fear of gas attacks. Europe is locked in a brutal, unprecedented conflict, a meat grinder of human lives. Your modern understanding of global pandemics, of viral mutations, of rapid international travel, offers a chilling perspective on what is about to unfold. Here, humanity is focused on an enemy across the trenches, completely unaware of the invisible, far deadlier enemy that is about to sweep across the globe, claiming more lives than the war itself. Your sophisticated medical systems, your global communication networks, are luxuries that this war-torn world desperately lacks. The Spanish flu, a misnomer born from Spain's neutrality, which allowed its press to report on the flu openly, unlike warring nations suppressing news to maintain morale, likely originated elsewhere, perhaps in the United States or France. It began subtly, a seemingly mild flu season in the spring of 1918. But then a terrifying mutation occurred, and by the autumn a second, far deadlier wave erupted, fueled by the global movement of troops and exacerbated by the crowded, unsanitary conditions of wartime. Imagine the terrifying progression of this particular influenza strain, caused by the H1N1 virus. It begins like a typical flu, fever, chills, body aches. But then, for many victims, especially young, healthy adults, the symptoms rapidly escalate. You would witness a person, seemingly robust, quickly developing pneumonia, their lungs filling with fluid, turning a horrifying blue from lack of oxygen. They would cough up frothy, blood-tinged sputum, struggling desperately for breath. The sheer speed of death was shocking. Many died within days, some within hours, often drowning in their own bodily fluids. The body's own immune system, particularly strong in young adults, seemed to overreact, causing a cytokine storm that destroyed lung tissue. The sensory experience is one of overwhelming illness and a chilling silence. The constant coughing, the gasping for breath, the frantic cries of the sick and their overwhelmed caregivers, these become the pervasive sounds. The smell of sickness, of disinfectants, and of death would cling to every surface. The sight of young, healthy individuals, their faces turning blue, their bodies racked with fever, would be a constant, horrifying reminder of the flu's indiscriminate nature. The fear isn't just of death, but of a rapid, agonizing demise, particularly for those in the prime of their lives. The social and cultural impact was immense. Hospitals were overwhelmed, doctors and nurses themselves falling ill. Morgues overflowed and coffins became scarce. You might see entire families wiped out or children orphaned, left to fend for themselves. Public life ground to a halt. Schools, theaters, and churches closed. Cities imposed quarantines and people wore masks, though their effectiveness was debatable. The psychological toll was immense. People were already exhausted by 4 years of war, and now this invisible enemy struck from within, adding another layer of despair and grief. The demographic impact was particularly strange. Unlike typical flu strains that disproportionately affect the very young and the very old, the Spanish flu had a distinct W-shaped mortality curve, with a high death rate among those aged 20 to 40, the very cohort fighting in the war and forming the backbone of society. This loss of young, productive adults had long-lasting consequences for demographics and economies. Estimates suggest the Spanish flu infected 1/3 of the world's population and killed an astonishing 50 to 100 million people worldwide, far more than the 15 to 22 million killed in World War I. The political and economic consequences were also profound. The flu hampered military operations as soldiers on both sides fell ill in vast numbers. It disrupted supply chains, slowed industrial production, and further strained already stretched wartime economies. The scale of death led to social unrest and a profound questioning of authority. You might see governments struggling to maintain order, their credibility undermined by their inability to combat the invisible killer. The pandemic, coming at the tail end of the war, also complicated peace negotiations and the demobilization of troops. The Spanish flu, though largely overshadowed by the war and historical memory, fundamentally changed how we understand pandemics. It highlighted the interconnectedness of the world, demonstrating how a novel virus could spread globally with terrifying speed. It spurred early efforts in virology and epidemiology, laying the groundwork for future pandemic preparedness. You might read about the early attempts to develop a vaccine, though these were largely unsuccessful due to the rudimentary understanding of viruses at the time. The strange epidemic of the Spanish flu didn't just kill millions. It reshaped global demographics, strained societies already at breaking point, and served as a chilling precursor to the pandemics of the 21st century. It was a silent partner to the Great War, a reminder that even in humanity's most brutal conflicts, nature can unleash a force far more devastating. And as you put on your mask during a modern pandemic or get your annual flu shot, remember the blue faces and gasping breaths of those who faced the Spanish flu, a time when the world truly learned the terrifying power of an invisible enemy. You are now in mid-20th century America, let's say the summer of 1952. The country is enjoying post-war prosperity, a burgeoning middle class, and the promise of a bright future. But as summer approaches, a shadow falls over communities, particularly those with young children. The air is filled with the sounds of children playing ice cream trucks and distant baseball games, but beneath this idyllic surface, a creeping dread takes hold. Your modern world, largely free from the terror of polio thanks to widespread vaccination, cannot fully grasp the fear that gripped parents every summer. This isn't a disease that kills quickly or en masse. It's a capricious, terrifying illness that can steal a child's mobility, condemning them to a life in an iron lung or with withered limbs. Poliomyelitis, or polio, caused by the polio virus, is an ancient disease, but it became a significant public health problem in developed countries in the late 19th and 20th centuries. With improved sanitation, children were exposed to the virus less frequently in infancy when they still had some maternal antibodies, making them more susceptible to infection at an older age when the disease was more likely to cause paralysis. It was a disease of modern hygiene, a paradox. Imagine the terrifying progression of polio. It often begins subtly with flu-like symptoms: fever, sore throat, headache, and vomiting. For most people, the infection is asymptomatic or causes only mild, temporary illness. But for a small, tragic percentage, the virus invades the central nervous system, particularly the motor neurons in the spinal cord. You would witness a child, seemingly recovering from a mild fever, suddenly developing muscle weakness, intense pain, and then paralysis. This paralysis could be temporary or permanent, affecting one limb, both legs, or even the muscles of breathing. The sensory experience is one of heartbreaking silence and visible suffering. The sound of a child struggling to breathe in an iron lung, the rhythmic hiss of the machine, would be a constant, chilling presence in hospitals. The sight of children with braces, crutches, or in wheelchairs, their limbs withered from paralysis, would be a stark reminder of the disease's cruel legacy. The fear isn't just of death, though polio could be fatal if it paralyzed the respiratory muscles. It's the fear of permanent disability, of a child's future irrevocably altered, their vibrant energy replaced by a lifetime of physical challenges. The social and cultural impact of polio was immense. It was known as the summer scourge because outbreaks typically peaked in the warmer months. Parents lived in terror, keeping their children away from swimming pools, movie theaters, and other public gatherings, desperate to protect them. You might see entire neighborhoods emptied of children during the summer, as families fled to isolated rural areas. The disease struck seemingly at random, affecting children from all social classes, adding to the pervasive sense of helplessness. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, himself a polio survivor, became a powerful symbol of the fight against the disease, establishing the Warm Springs Foundation and the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, later the March of Dimes, to fund research. The iron lung became a terrifying symbol of polio. These massive, coffin-like machines encased patients, using negative pressure to force their lungs to breathe when their own respiratory muscles were paralyzed. You might imagine the claustrophobia, the isolation, the sheer terror of being dependent on such a machine for every breath. These mechanical marvels, while life-saving, highlighted the brutal reality of severe polio. The race for a vaccine became a national obsession, a scientific quest fueled by public fear and massive fundraising efforts. Scientists like Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin became household names. You might read about the intense competition, the meticulous research, and the ethical dilemmas involved in vaccine development. In 1955, Jonas Salk's inactivated polio vaccine (IPV) was declared safe and effective, leading to widespread celebrations and a massive vaccination campaign. Albert Sabin's oral polio vaccine (OPV), developed later, offered advantages in mass administration and gut immunity. The long-term consequences of polio vaccination are one of humanity's greatest public health triumphs. Widespread vaccination campaigns in the mid-20th century led to a dramatic decline in polio cases in industrialized nations. The disease, once a terrifying summer ritual, began to disappear. The global effort to eradicate polio, launched in 1988, has seen cases plummet by over 99%. You might witness the ongoing efforts to reach the last few pockets of the virus in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, a testament to the dedication required to wipe out a disease entirely. Polio was a strange epidemic not just for its capricious nature and its ability to inflict lifelong disability, but for the profound fear it instilled in a generation of parents. It didn't just paralyze millions. It catalyzed one of the most successful public health campaigns in history, demonstrating the power of scientific research and global cooperation. The fear of polio and the subsequent triumph of vaccination transformed our approach to infectious diseases, proving that a concerted effort could turn a terrifying scourge into a memory. And as you watch children play freely, unburdened by the summer dread, remember the iron lungs and withered limbs, and the quiet heroism of the scientists who gave us the gift of a polio-free world. You are now in the early 1980s, specifically in cities like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. The air is vibrant with the energy of a new decade, of cultural shifts and burgeoning freedoms, particularly within certain communities. Your modern understanding of HIV as a manageable chronic condition, your access to highly effective antiretroviral therapies, offers a stark contrast to the terror, ignorance, and profound social stigma that accompanied the emergence of AIDS. Here, a new mysterious illness is starting to appear, striking down young, seemingly healthy men, primarily gay men, and it will unleash a wave of fear, discrimination, and activism that will forever change the landscape of public health and social justice. The first reports of a strange, new illness began to surface in 1981. Doctors in Los Angeles and New York noticed clusters of rare diseases, Kaposi sarcoma, a type of cancer, and pneumocystis pneumonia, a fungal infection, in young gay men, diseases typically only seen in elderly or severely immunocompromised patients. The initial term, gay-related immune deficiency, GRID, reflected the early misguided understanding of the disease, and immediately attached a devastating social stigma. It would later be identified as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome (AIDS), caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. Imagine the terrifying progression of AIDS in its early days. It often began subtly with unexplained fevers, night sweats, swollen lymph nodes, and profound fatigue. Then, as the immune system slowly collapsed, victims would become susceptible to a host of opportunistic infections, rare cancers, fungal infections, severe wasting, and neurological disorders. You would witness a person once vibrant and full of life, slowly wasting away, their body ravaged by multiple illnesses, their mind sometimes clouded by dementia. The sensory experience is one of profound physical deterioration and emotional anguish. The smell of sickness, of medicated lotions, and the pervasive scent of fear would cling to hospital wards. The sight of emaciated bodies, their skin covered in lesions, their eyes hollow, would be a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the disease's relentless progression. The fear wasn't just of death, which was almost inevitable in the early years. It was the fear of social ostracization, of being abandoned by family and friends, of dying alone and unmourned, deemed a pariah by society. The social and cultural impact of HIV/AIDS was immediate and devastating, igniting a massive moral panic. Because of its initial concentration in gay male communities, the disease was often framed as a gay plague, a divine punishment for immoral lifestyles. This led to widespread discrimination. People with AIDS were fired from their jobs, evicted from their homes, denied medical care, and even shunned by their own families. You might witness the public fear fueled by misinformation, leading to calls for quarantines and even the tattooing of people with HIV. The lack of understanding about transmission routes led to irrational fears about casual contact, further isolating those affected. However, this period also saw the rise of powerful activism and advocacy. Gay communities, already organized from the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, quickly mobilized. Organizations like ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, emerged, using direct action and public protest to demand government funding for research, faster drug approval processes, and an end to discrimination. You might read about their iconic demonstrations, their fierce advocacy, and their unwavering commitment to fighting for the lives of those deemed expendable by society. This activism fundamentally changed the patient-doctor relationship and influenced drug development processes for all diseases. The scientific response, though initially slow, eventually led to groundbreaking discoveries. The identification of HIV as the causative agent in 1983–84, the development of the first antiretroviral drug AZT in 1987, and then the revolutionary cocktail therapy, HAART, in the mid-1990s, transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable, chronic condition. You might witness the dramatic shift in prognosis, as people with HIV, once facing imminent death, could now live long, healthy lives, thanks to continuous scientific breakthroughs. The long-term consequences of HIV/AIDS are still unfolding. It has killed tens of millions globally, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where it continues to be a major public health crisis. It forced a global reckoning with issues of sexuality, drug use, and public health policy. It highlighted the devastating impact of stigma and discrimination on disease control. It also demonstrated the power of community activism in driving scientific progress and social change. You might reflect on how the lessons learned from the AIDS crisis, the importance of funding research, of patient advocacy, of comprehensive sex education, and of fighting stigma, continue to inform our responses to other epidemics. HIV/AIDS was a strange epidemic not just for its novel viral nature and its devastating impact on the immune system, but for the profound social and political battles it ignited. It didn't just kill millions. It forced societies to confront their prejudices, mobilized marginalized communities into powerful political forces, and fundamentally reshaped our understanding of disease, sexuality, and human rights. It remains a powerful testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion, a modern plague that continues to shape our world. You are now in London in the sweltering summer of 1665. The city is a bustling, vibrant, but also incredibly overcrowded and unsanitary metropolis, still largely medieval in its layout. The air is thick with the pervasive smell of human and animal waste, coal smoke, and the general effluvium of a densely packed urban center. Your modern understanding of hygiene, your sewage systems, your antibiotics, are luxuries that these Londoners could only dream of. Here, the bubonic plague, that ancient, terrifying killer, is about to make its last devastating stand in England, transforming the city in ways that no one could have imagined. The plague had been a recurring nightmare for London for centuries, but the Great Plague of 1665 was to be its final, most severe visitation. It likely arrived via Dutch trading ships, carried by infected rats and their fleas. The first cases were reported in the spring in St. Giles in the Fields, a poor, crowded parish outside the city walls. Initially, the deaths were dismissed as typical seasonal ailments, but as the summer heat intensified, so too did the death toll, rising exponentially. Imagine the horrifying progression of the bubonic plague. It begins suddenly with fever, chills, and extreme weakness. Then the telltale buboes appear, painful, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck, often turning black and oozing pus. You would witness victims experiencing intense pain, delirium, and often internal bleeding, leading to dark patches on the skin, giving rise to the term Black Death. Death often comes within days, sometimes hours, a swift and brutal end. The pneumonic form of the plague, which infected the lungs and could spread directly from person to person through coughs, was even more terrifying and almost universally fatal. The sensory experience is one of overwhelming stench and pervasive fear. The smell of death, initially subtle, becomes a suffocating blanket over the city. The constant tolling of church bells, marking the passage of countless souls, becomes a chilling soundtrack to daily life. You hear the mournful cries of "Bring out your dead," as carts piled high with corpses, often still warm, trundle through the streets. The sight of plague pits, vast trenches filled with bodies, would be a common and horrifying reality. The fear isn't just of death, but of a rapid, agonizing demise, and the abandonment by loved ones desperate to avoid contagion. The social and cultural impact was immediate and devastating. As the death toll mounted, panic gripped the city. The wealthy fled to the countryside, including King Charles II and his court, leaving the poor and the essential workers to face the brunt of the epidemic. You might see the city emptying, shops closing, streets becoming eerily quiet except for the cries of the sick and the death carts. Quarantines were imposed, often with watchmen guarding infected houses, painting a red cross and the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," on the door. These measures, while well-intentioned, often led to further suffering and despair for those trapped inside. The role of the plague doctors, with their distinctive bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believed to ward off miasma, became a grim symbol of the era. You might see these figures, grotesque and terrifying, moving through the streets, offering little in the way of cure but a stark reminder of the disease's presence. The official weekly bills of mortality recorded the soaring death tolls, reaching thousands a week at its peak, a chilling statistic that fueled the pervasive terror. The long-term consequences of the Great Plague, while devastating in the short term, were ironically tied to a subsequent catastrophe. The plague officially ended in London in the autumn of 1666, not because of medical intervention, but because of a massive, unplanned cleansing, the Great Fire of London. The fire, which started in September 1666, raged for 4 days, destroying much of the wooden, overcrowded, and unsanitary medieval city. While the fire itself caused few deaths, it effectively eradicated the rats and their fleas, along with the filthy conditions that allowed the plague to thrive. The Great Plague didn't just kill an estimated 100,000 Londoners, about a quarter of the city's population. It, combined with the Great Fire, fundamentally reshaped London. You might witness the city being rebuilt with wider streets, brick houses instead of wood, and improved sanitation, laying the groundwork for a healthier urban environment. The memory of the plague and the fire led to greater attention to public health and urban planning, lessons that would resonate for centuries. The plague, in its final brutal act, inadvertently paved the way for a more modern, healthier London. As you step back from the burning, plague-ridden streets of 17th century London, and return to your world of modern urban planning and public health, consider the strange and terrible irony of the Great Plague. It was a terrifying final chapter for the ancient scourge in England, but its devastation, coupled with the fire, became a catalyst for dramatic, positive change. The plague didn't just kill, it forced a city to be reborn from its ashes, a stark reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, profound transformation can emerge, forever altering the landscape of human habitation and health. You are now in ancient Athens, Greece in the summer of 430 BC. The city is at the pinnacle of its golden age, a beacon of democracy, philosophy, and artistic achievement. The Parthenon gleams on the Acropolis, the Agora bustles with intellectual debate, and the plays of Sophocles and Euripides draw eager crowds. But this is also a city at war, locked in the desperate Peloponnesian War against its rival, Sparta. The air is charged with tension, the smell of olive groves and the salty tang of the Aegean Sea. Your modern medical knowledge, your understanding of epidemiology, stands in stark contrast to the utter bewilderment and helplessness that gripped the Athenians as a strange, devastating plague descended upon them. This isn't just a medical tragedy, it's a political and social cataclysm, meticulously documented by one of history's greatest observers. The Plague of Athens erupted early in the Peloponnesian War. Athens, under the strategic guidance of Pericles, had adopted a defensive strategy: withdraw its rural population inside the city walls and rely on its naval superiority to import supplies and raid Spartan territory. This strategy, while militarily sound, created a dangerously overcrowded city, a perfect breeding ground for disease. The plague arrived, likely through Athens' port of Piraeus, carried by ships bringing supplies. Its exact identity remains a mystery to this day, though theories range from typhus, smallpox, measles, or even a form of Ebola. Imagine the horrifying symptoms as described by the historian Thucydides, who himself survived the plague. It began suddenly with violent headaches, burning eyes, and a redness and inflammation of the throat and tongue. This was followed by sneezing, hoarseness, and a severe cough. Then the body erupted in pustules and ulcers. Victims suffered from intense thirst, relentless vomiting, and severe diarrhea. The internal heat was so intense that many threw themselves into cold water, desperately seeking relief. Unlike many other diseases, the plague seemed to attack all parts of the body simultaneously. The sensory experience is one of unimaginable suffering and rampant death. The smell of sickness, of vomit, of unburied bodies, would be pervasive and suffocating. The constant cries of the sick, the desperate pleas for water, and the wails of the bereaved would fill the air. You would witness the streets becoming a graveyard, with bodies lying unburied, as the living were too sick, too terrified, or too overwhelmed to perform proper funeral rites. Thucydides recounts how dogs and birds that fed on the corpses died, further adding to the sense of an unnatural, malevolent force at work. The social and cultural impact was immediate and profound. The plague utterly shattered the moral and social fabric of Athenian society. The respect for law and custom collapsed. People, believing they would die anyway, indulged in reckless behavior, abandoning all restraint. You might see individuals seizing property, engaging in wanton acts, and disregarding religious piety, as the gods seemed powerless to intervene. Families abandoned their sick, and the dying were left to fend for themselves. Even the traditional burial rituals, so central to Greek culture, broke down, replaced by mass graves and hasty cremations. The very foundations of Athenian democracy and civic duty crumbled under the weight of the epidemic. The political and military consequences were devastating. The plague killed an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of Athens' population, including its visionary leader, Pericles. This loss of leadership, combined with the decimation of its fighting forces, severely hampered Athens' war effort. You might witness the morale of the Athenian army plummeting, their ranks thinned not by Spartan spears, but by an invisible enemy. The plague forced Athens to abandon its strategy of relying on its walls, and it fundamentally weakened the city at a critical juncture in the war. The loss of so many citizens meant fewer rowers for its mighty fleet, fewer soldiers for its hoplite army, and fewer citizens to participate in its democratic institutions. Thucydides' account is particularly chilling because of its detached, clinical observation. He focuses not just on the medical symptoms, but on the profound psychological and social breakdown caused by the plague. His writings provide a unique window into humanity's response to an existential crisis, a timeless lesson on how fear and death can strip away the veneer of civilization. You might read his words centuries later, and feel a profound connection to the despair and chaos that gripped Athens. The long-term consequences of the plague of Athens are undeniable. It didn't just kill thousands, it fundamentally altered the course of the Peloponnesian War, directly contributing to Athens' eventual defeat. The loss of Pericles, a leader of immense wisdom and foresight, left a void that was never truly filled, leading to more erratic and ultimately disastrous political decisions. The plague weakened Athens' democratic institutions and paved the way for its decline as the dominant power in the Greek world. The strange epidemic of the plague of Athens stands as a powerful testament to the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations when confronted with an unknown biological threat. It didn't just kill, it eroded morality, dissolved social bonds, and fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance of the ancient world. And as you reflect on Thucydides' chilling account, and return to your modern world of epidemiology and crisis management, remember that even in humanity's greatest moments, an unseen enemy can emerge from the shadows, dictating the fate of empires and changing history forever. You are now in Hong Kong in the late 19th century, let's say 1894. The city is a bustling British colonial port, a vibrant crossroads of East and West, teeming with trade and people from across the globe. The air is thick with the scent of spices, the salty tang of the sea, and the pervasive odors of a crowded, rapidly industrializing city. Your modern understanding of public health, of disease vectors, of targeted treatments, is a stark contrast to the scientific frontier of this era. Here, an ancient enemy, the bubonic plague, is about to launch its third major global assault, but this time, it will be met by the nascent science of bacteriology, leading to crucial breakthroughs that will forever change how we fight disease. The third plague pandemic began in Yunnan province, China, in the mid-19th century, slowly spreading along trade routes. By 1894, it had reached Hong Kong, a critical global port, making its leap to international notoriety. This wasn't a new disease. It was the same Yersinia pestis bacterium that caused the plague of Justinian and the Black Death. But now, in an era of steamships and global trade, it was poised for unprecedented worldwide dissemination. Imagine the horrifying progression of this familiar, yet still terrifying disease. It begins with a sudden onset of high fever, chills, and profound weakness. Then the telltale buboes appear, excruciatingly painful, swollen lymph nodes, often in the groin or armpits, which can grow to the size of an apple and turn black. You would witness victims suffering from intense delirium, internal bleeding leading to dark patches on the skin, and often a rapid, agonizing death within days. The pneumonic form, which infected the lungs and spread person to person through coughing, was even more virulent and almost universally fatal. The sensory experience is one of overwhelming stench and pervasive dread. The smell of sickness, of decaying flesh, and of the desperate efforts to disinfect would cling to the crowded tenements. The constant cries of the sick, the wails of the bereaved, and the mournful sounds of funeral processions would fill the air. You would see the colonial authorities struggling to contain the outbreak, imposing quarantines and attempting to clear slums, often meeting with resistance from the local population. The fear isn't just of death, but of a particularly gruesome, rapid demise, and the forced isolation from family and community. The social and cultural impact was immense. The plague caused widespread panic and social disruption in Hong Kong and other port cities it reached. The colonial authorities, fearing economic collapse and social unrest, implemented draconian public health measures, often clashing with local customs and beliefs. You might witness the forced evacuation of entire districts, the burning of homes, and the imposition of strict quarantines, measures that were often seen as oppressive and discriminatory by the local Chinese population. This tension between public health imperatives and cultural sensitivities became a recurring theme throughout the pandemic. However, the third plague pandemic also became a crucible for scientific discovery. In Hong Kong in 1894, two rival bacteriologists, Alexander Yersin, a French-Swiss scientist, and Shibasaburo Kitasato, a Japanese scientist, independently raced to identify the causative agent of the plague. You might read about their intense competition, their meticulous work in makeshift laboratories, examining samples from victims. Yersin, working in simpler conditions, was the first to successfully isolate and identify the bacterium, which was later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. This was a monumental breakthrough, confirming the bacterial cause of the plague and disproving the centuries-old miasma theory. The identification of the bacterium was just the beginning. The next crucial discovery came in 1898, when Paul-Louis Simond, another French scientist, demonstrated that fleas on rats were the primary vectors for transmitting the plague to humans. You might imagine the profound shift in understanding. It wasn't bad air, it wasn't divine punishment, it was tiny fleas jumping from infected rats to humans. This discovery provided the key to effective control strategies: rat extermination, improved sanitation, and quarantine measures specifically targeting ships and cargo. The long-term consequences of the third plague pandemic, which officially lasted until 1959, were profound. It killed an estimated 12 million people, primarily in India and China, but it also spurred the development of modern epidemiology and bacteriology. It demonstrated the critical role of scientific research in understanding and combating infectious diseases. You might witness the implementation of new public health measures worldwide, including port inspections, rodent control programs, and improved sanitation, all aimed at preventing the spread of plague and other infectious diseases. The development of streptomycin in the mid-20th century finally provided an effective treatment for the plague, further reducing its mortality. The strange epidemic of the third plague pandemic didn't just kill millions. It became a pivotal moment in the history of science, marking the transition from an era of ignorance about disease to one of scientific understanding and effective intervention. It was the last great global stand of the bubonic plague, but it was also the pandemic that taught humanity how to fight back, forever changing the landscape of public health and our relationship with the microbial world. And as you reflect on the scientific triumphs born from this ancient scourge, remember the bustling ports and crowded slums, and the quiet dedication of the scientists who, in the face of overwhelming death, finally unveiled the invisible killer.